My name is Bridget Whalen. I'm with an organization called the Opportunity Agenda. We are a social justice communication lab. So we are engaged in communication support specifically for leaders who are working to drive social change. So we are a communications lab, but we're also embedded in the work, and that gives us, I think, unique perspective to talk about the difficult challenges, particularly when we talk about making social change. There are unique challenges to this work, and so we're here to present some of our thoughts, some of our research, and some of our best knowledge on how do we do this effectively to really make change, not only change in the short term, but change that really lasts. And as Jody said, that changes hearts and minds and sets us up for longer term and transformative change. So my name is Bridget Whalen. I'm the training and engagement coordinator with the Opportunity Agenda, so I do a lot of trainings just like this, in rooms like this, with people like you, to really equip you with some tools and some knowledge to do this work better. And I give you my contact information on purpose, because we would love to hear from you. Y'all are really working in the field and are much closer to these issues than we are. And so we constantly are refining our approach and rethinking the way that we do things based on what we hear from people who are actually in the field having to do this work. I already gave you a little bit of information about us. I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we work on, because you're going to be hearing a lot of examples from those different sectors today, and that's actually by design. So we work on immigrant rights, criminal justice reform, and economic opportunity primarily. We also work broadly on social change. But I'm going to share a lot of examples from those sectors today because I think y'all are talking about building a movement. And part of that is, what can we learn from other social change movements? What has worked for them? Where did they need to pivot and start talking and doing things differently? And what can we learn and what can we take away from those lessons? So this is really about changing mindsets, changing hearts and minds, changing those big stories that we sometimes call narratives. And how do we do that? We do that in a number of different ways. We're going to talk about some of that today and unpack that. But I'm going to show you a little example of our superhero character we created named Helvetica Bold, who really learned that, unfortunately, as Jody said, the facts are on our side. We have the solutions. We have alternatives that are working. But if we're not communicating those effectively, if we're just giving people facts, we're not changing their minds. We need to connect those facts to values that we share with the audiences that we're trying to reach and that we're ultimately trying to move and persuade. So I'm going to let you see how Helvetica goes on this journey.
Her name was Ariel Black, a mild-mannered social justice advocate who believed that cold, hard facts alone could change the world. Until she confronted a powerful supervillain named the Mindset, who had locked people's minds into boxes of fear, making them impervious to facts.
Gay welfare queens from Mexico are slaves by your bootstraps.
How can we get through to people?
But then one day, in a freak printing press accident that unleashed the voices of revolutionary thinkers and leaders from the past.
Wait a sec. What's happening to me?
Ariel was given the power to transform the discourse, reconnecting us to our shared values.
Whoa. This is badass. Take that, dominant narrative. Oh yeah, now we're talking.
She's got the power to flip the script and free your mind. She is Helvetica Bold.
The mindset is about to get reset.
Remember, stay tuned and be bold.
All right. So I always like to share Helvetica. Helvetica has a lot of adventures you can find on YouTube. But I think it's an important example of the way we talk about things. We talk about things from a fact-based perspective. And what we're actually doing is just bouncing off people's minds. We sometimes talk about framing, which is a concept y'all might be familiar with. And that facts bounce off frames. If the fact you're giving me doesn't fit with my worldview, I don't reject my worldview, I reject your fact, right? So we have to find a way to get into people. How do we find those entry points? And what we learn through messaging research and testing is that those entry points are shared values. That's how we actually reach people. That's how we open them up to having a conversation with us, and that's how we change minds. So just quickly, an overview of communications. There's a lot of different types of communications, and I want to be clear about what we're talking about today. So there's branding communications. This is what each of you do at your organization or at the schools that you work or for the foundations that you work for, the soul of your organization. Who are we as an organization? That's your brand. There's campaign communications. So campaign communications can be a lot of different things. I think of this as anything that has a specific goal in mind and is time limited in some way. So we're running this campaign for the next 18 months, and at the end of it, we're going to know if we won or we lost, right? So it's short term. There's crisis communications. Hopefully you never need to use a crisis communications plan, but it does happen. Think of organizations like Planned Parenthood, who has a very sophisticated crisis communications plan and continues to weather a lot of the attacks against them, versus an organization like Acorn. Does anyone remember Acorn? They did not have a crisis communications plan, and they are no longer in business. What we're really going to focus on today is this long-term movement of hearts and minds that Jody talked about. And if we figure that out, and we get that right, and we get that really rooted in our vision and our values, it makes the rest of this a lot easier. And where groups and folks often find a disconnect is between their campaign communications, their short-term communications, and that long-term movement of hearts and minds. Because it can be really tempting to sacrifice your narrative for the sake of a short-term win. And groups do this all the time. And when we're not really, really clear about what is the long-term change we're trying to drive, we make a lot of mistakes in that campaign communications that sets us up for failure in the future. So how do we move hearts and minds? How do we actually do that? We do that with values-based narratives. So narratives are those big stories. Again, it's that long-term change that we're trying to make. And we do that also with a drumbeat of connected messages. And I think that's really important because there's a lot of people in this room. And if y'all are speaking from the same place of values that you share, we start getting this narrative to gain some traction. If we have a bunch of people going back to their communities, going back to their organizations, going back to the context in which they work, talking differently about education, about equity, about learning, we start to build that drumbeat of connection. And if we're all just doing this disjointed, we're not harnessing the power of y'all being together in this room for these 2 days and the work going forward. So to give you a quick example of this tension between the short-term and long-term strategy, I'm going to give you an example from the immigration context. The CDC released a report about the concerns around immigrants bringing tuberculosis into the United States. And advocates working on immigrant rights seized on this because it was testing well as something that was going to drive them to getting undocumented people health care, which is something they wanted. That was a campaign goal. And so they seized on this message, and they started using it in their campaign. You know, if we don't get undocumented people health care, your nanny is going to give your child tuberculosis. And they won that campaign. They got health care in California for undocumented people. But what story did they tell about who immigrants are? What was the long-term narrative they promoted that they're still dealing with today? That we need to fear immigrants, that they bring us disease, and that there's something we need to protect ourselves from. They set themselves up for a long-term story that is counter to their goals. And unfortunately, we do this all the time. So we need to be really, really clear about what that long-term story is. And there are times when we have to make strategic decisions in the short term that are not ideal. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. But we need to at least know when we're doing that, and we know what sacrifices we are not willing to make. So what is a narrative? Someone shout out to me 1 word, 2 words about what is a narrative. A story, yes. At its most basic form, it's a story. So there are a lot of stories that are very, very familiar. And we like to use these when we talk about narrative strategy because they are so familiar, people fill in a lot of context. There's a lot that goes unsaid, a lot we don't have to explain. So a narrative like this, David and Goliath, it's an underdog story, right? This is a story that's been told and retold and repackaged to us over and over and over again. And now we know how to recognize this. That's an underdog story. I'm rooting for the underdog. No one's rooting for Goliath, I hope. It's a story that has a lot of attached context to it that we understand, and it's familiar. Another example is a story like the hero's journey. There's a lot of stories out there like this. We have a young hero who becomes activated, they find a mentor, they go on this journey, and they come out victorious, right? So a narrative is really just a story. It has heroes, it has villains. Sometimes the villains are ideas, not people. We want to be careful that the villain is not the government. Sometimes we fall into that trap too, which can get in the way of long-term change. Narratives have familiar themes and values and morals. Another way to think about narrative is that it's a big story. It's rooted in shared values and themes, and it influences how people process information and make decisions. So again, there are these big stories that don't have a clear beginning, middle, and end, and nevertheless, we attach so much context and meaning to them. And we can reframe big narratives that are out there. So we talked a little bit about the mindset being our supervillain and the dominant narrative. And sometimes the dominant narrative is really unhelpful to the change we're trying to make. And so our work is to not just engage people on a campaign level and a short-term level, but to actually change the way that they fundamentally think about the issue, to change that long-term narrative. So how do we do this? We use this structure for narrative development. I think this is the one that we have found works for us. There's a lot of different ways to develop narratives. But it's really a feedback loop. We start with what are our values and our priorities. We do research. So at the Opportunity Agenda, we specifically do public opinion and media research. And that helps us inform where are people already at so that we know where we can take them. And then we use experience. So we use the experience of people in the field. How does this work when we actually trot this narrative out and try to use it? Where does it fail? Where is it strong? Where do we see people actually persuaded and actually move to action? So to give you a couple examples of this, of narratives that have really shifted over time because people started talking differently about these issues, we do some work around drug policy reform, which is an issue that has changed dramatically in the last 10 or so years. It wasn't that long ago, so I think this poster is from like the 1940s, that we talked about drug policy and drugs and drug users with this very sinful frame. This was about vice. This was about debauchery, right? This is about evil. It was a very moralistic frame that really made moral assumptions about people that use drugs. We moved into, I was a kid, product of DARE, the DARE program. We moved to this very individualistic frame. This is about individual people and their bad choices. And if they just said no. And when people make bad choices, we should punish them. So that was the way people were talking about drug policy. And you can see the way that we handled drug policy in the 90s, for example, with a very punitive approach. So because of the way we were talking about it, it led people to a very punitive solution. We should lock people up. These people are bad, they're making bad decisions, and we should put them in jail. We have come, in the last 10 years or so, in the wake of the opioid crisis, to really talk about drug policy from a public health perspective. And there's a racialized aspect to this. Opioid users, sorry, I keep popping my microphone. Opioid users are predominantly white. So we're taking a much more compassionate approach. Nevertheless, this is an encouraging trend because people started talking differently about drug users, who they were, why this happens, and we started talking about it from a systems level. That this is a system of churning, the way the pharmaceutical industry works, the way that doctors are treating opioids, the way that we are treating opioid users, and the way we are punishing them and how that is not an appropriate response, it doesn't work. People started talking differently about that, and we're starting to see some positive change. So in 2016, Legal Action Center did a survey where we found that 57% of the American public now supported the president who wanted additional investment in more education, prevention, and treatment. Back in the mid-90s, we had peak levels in public opinion research of people wanting more punitive measures. Lock more people up, we have a zero tolerance policy, drug users need to be in jail, that's where they belong. 63% of the American public believe we put too many nonviolent drug offenders in prison instead of treating their addiction. Again, so it's that we're finally starting to see public opinion shift away from that punitive approach and to a more compassionate public health approach. And then 78% believe we need to treat it as a public health problem, not a criminal problem. So I'm going to give you an example of how advocates started talking about this differently and how far we've actually come. This is the mayor of Ithaca, New York. His name's Svante Myrick. Ithaca was the first city in the country to start creating safe injection sites for heroin users. So that's a very compassionate public health response to a problem in their community. And Svante talks about this, again, from a systems perspective. This is a system that isn't working, and we have to do things differently. I do want to flag, Svante uses the word addict, which is not a word that drug policy reform advocates use because it's stigmatizing. Nevertheless, I think he delivers a really powerful message here.
You bring a unique perspective to this. You are 28, a young mayor, but also somebody of the generation that this is affecting directly. And do I understand you also know addiction firsthand from your own family?
I do. My father is an addict, and heroin was never his drug. But I learned at the age of 5 years old what addiction was, what it meant, and the toll it can have on a family. And it just tore us apart. And the system failed. The system failed him, and it failed our family. And I thought that was unique to us, but I was elected to the city council when I was 20 years old. I was still a junior at Cornell University. I got elected mayor when I was 24. I've been in elected office for 9 years now. I'm now lead a system, and I watch that system fail people every day in the same way that the system failed my family. And I realized that this is not working. This is not working, and it's unacceptable. I can't read another editorial or op-ed from a newspaper saying we've got to do something about this problem, but never actually doing anything about it. This is something we can do. This will save lives. This will give addicts another day and another chance to get clean.
Does that sound different than how we're used to thinking about drug policy and the way we talk about drug users? Does that sound different? We have changed in a very short amount of time radically the way we talk about these things. It wasn't that long ago we were still talking about just say no. Just say no. And now we're talking about a public health approach. So the way we talk about the change we're trying to make is critically important because it actually makes that change possible. You have to change people's minds before you can get them to support the solutions and alternatives you're working towards. Another example of this is around marriage equality. This is a social change issue that we've actually made progress on. So that's good. For a long time, advocates were talking about marriage equality from a frame of rights and benefits. Gay couples deserve the same rights and benefits that straight couples do, and that's why we need marriage equality. But they weren't getting anywhere. And they were using this message over and over and over and over and over again. And all that was happening was states were starting to put ballot measures to make it constitutional amendments to outlaw same-sex marriage equality. They weren't winning. And they started to figure out the way we're talking about this isn't working because what our audiences are hearing is people get married for rights and benefits. But that's not why I got married. Why do people get married? Love, commitment. There was fundamentally something wrong that wasn't connecting to their audiences because people don't think about marriage as a rights and benefits issue. They think about it as a love issue. So that was an ad in California. We started shifting the way we talked about marriage equality, and we started to see progress in, again, a very short amount of time. What if you couldn't marry the person you loved? We completely shifted the context that we weren't just denying people rights and benefits, we were denying them a fundamental part of their humanity, to love someone and to have that love affirmed and to be able to commit your life to them. It's a completely different framing that actually has the possibility to change people's minds. So we talked about narrative and these big narratives and how if we talk differently about the issues that we work on, we can change those narratives over time. But part of how we talk differently is on a more short-term level with specific audiences, a more targeted level. And that's what we call messaging. So this is a mural in Long Beach, California. It's on the side of a child community health clinic. And this is about what makes up a healthy community. So it's a mural, it's this clinic's vision of a healthy community. So their clinic is a part of it, but there's also a park and green space. There's a thriving downtown. We have a theater. We have public schools. We have all of these other aspects of what makes up a healthy community. That's the narrative. The message is, we need to fix the slide on 7th Street because our kids need a safe place to play. Because we all buy into this idea of a healthy community and what that means, and parks are part of that. So on the messaging level, it's about a specific tangible thing with a specific goal in mind and a specific audience in mind. So that's how messaging level and narrative level differs, but they should be working together. They should be in concert with each other. Your messaging should uphold that big, larger narrative. So messaging differs from narrative because it's targeted. It has a specific goal in mind. And it has a specific audience in mind. And we have to talk differently to different audiences to get them to be persuaded. And ultimately, the goal of strategic communications is to persuade people. It's not just for them to hear you. It's for them to actually think differently, do something differently. So let's talk a little bit about audience, because this is really important, and it can be hard for people to understand. What are some audiences that y'all are trying to reach in your work? Just shout them out. Policymakers? School leaders, I think I heard. Who else? Teachers? Great. Students. Those are all very specific audiences. Sometimes people tell us, we need to reach the general public. We need to get the general public on our side, and then we're going to win. There is no such thing as the general public. And when it comes to communications, we do not have the time or the resources to reach everybody. It's physically impossible. And it's also not strategic because there are some people that we can't change their mind. Their minds are locked. And so we don't need, the good news is we don't need those people. The opposition to social change, when we do audience research, there are oppositional people out there who are kind of fundamentally opposed to some of the issues that we support. We will never change their mind, just like they will never change ours. What we know from research is it's like 17% of the population. So it's a small percentage of people. We don't need them. We don't need them. We need to know what they're saying because we need to make sure that we're neutralizing their impact on the other people in the middle. But we don't need to focus so much on what our opposition is saying. We sometimes think of audiences as this spectrum, a 1 to 5 scale. Our ones are our base. They're with us. We need to keep them mobilized. We need to keep them energized. But they're on board already. So we don't need to persuade them. So our strategy there is to mobilize them, energize them, amplify their voices, get them connected and taking action, but we don't need to spend a lot of time on the persuasion. Our 5s are the opposite extreme. They're our opposition. We don't want to spend a lot of time trying to persuade them either because it can't be done. But what we do want to do is know what they're saying so we can neutralize their effect on the people in the middle. So our 2s, 3s, and 4s are our persuadables, which is a term you may have heard of before. We use it in polling, we use it in public opinion research. Persuadable audiences. People who, if given the message in the right way, can actually be persuaded. So how do we move those people along? We have to identify themes, messengers. Sometimes we're not the right messenger. And what messages are actually going to work for them. And so again, we do this through research. People like the Opportunity Agenda, people like Frameworks Institute, which offered some possible values today for y'all to be working from. But also practice. Part of this is you've got to go in front of a school board to talk about a certain issue. You know kind of where 5 of those members lean, but you've got 4 who are up in the air. If I say this thing, if I try this message, did they change their mind? Where do they fall on this scale? How do they tend to vote on these issues? Right? So some of this is big picture thinking that sometimes takes actual research, and some of this is just on the ground, trying things, seeing what's working, seeing what's taking hold in your community, in your school, in the context in which you work. So when we think about audience, we want to think, where do they rank on that 1 to 5 scale? And this can be hard to know, and sometimes you're just guessing, and that's okay. I would challenge you to not put people in that oppositional box unless you are really, 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 really sure. We did some work with the Close Rikers campaign in New York City, who is working to close Rikers Island. And the mayor has agreed that he's going to take that step. 2 weeks before that happened, the Close Rikers organizer told me, Mayor Bill de Blasio is a 5 on closing Rikers Island. He is our opposition. 2 weeks later, he decided he was going to do it. So don't write people off because of who they may have voted for or what their political leanings might be. Try to persuade them until you realize that you can't, and then, maybe they are a 5. Sometimes we put people in that 5 box very quickly based on assumptions or prejudices that we might feel. What are they thinking about your issue? How much do you know about what they already know about this? What are they feeling? What are their values? And that values piece is really critically important. What are they hearing about your issue? Is this an issue that's gotten a lot of attention in your community? Are they reading about it in the newspaper? What does the newspaper say? Are they seeing it on the local news? What is the local news saying about it? What are they hearing? What other voices are in their ear? And then ultimately, what do you need them to do? How do they need to do something differently to get you to where you need to be that you're making change? So I want to share a few messaging strategy lessons, kind of general tips for how to message effectively, and then we're going to actually give you a tool for developing messages, and y'all will get some time to kind of workshop that a little bit. So we want to lead with shared values, and I touched on this already a little bit. Shared values are the thing that opens our persuadable audiences up to conversation. It's the entry point. It doesn't mean that we just only talk about values and we never get to the solutions we're proposing, but this is the starting point. It ensures that people don't initially feel alienated because they don't know what you're talking about. So sometimes we talk about policy, and we start the conversation there. And people feel alienated by policy because most persuadable audiences don't understand it, and frankly, they find it boring. So they're automatically tuning you out. Policy is critically important. We all know that. It affects our daily lives. But it's not always the most compelling way to start a conversation. Has anyone ever talked about policy over the Thanksgiving table? Do your relatives kind of all like, okay, that's nice, I'm going to talk to someone over here? It's boring. It bores people. People don't want to hear about something they don't understand and that's complicated. Issues. We often talk a lot about issues. Issues are better than talking about policy, but issues have the opposite problem. People think they know all about the issue, and you're not going to tell them anything they don't already know. 9 times out of 10, their minds are made up. Yeah, I've heard about that on the news. That's been a big deal in our community. I know about it, and I kind of already know where I stand. You're not getting people from a place where you can actually change their mind. If we start by talking about values, we actually open them up to that dialogue. We both care about this community, right? We both care about families having the tools they need to meet their basic needs. We both care about equal opportunity, that what you look like or where you come from shouldn't determine what opportunities you're given in this country. And that's why these problems are standing in our way. It's a fundamentally different way of getting people to think about a problem. And this is not just a theory. We actually know that this works. We test messages with people, and overwhelmingly we find that people that were persuadable on the issue going in find a message that leads with values to be more compelling than a message that leads with facts. So they end up changing their mind, if they were persuadable going in, because of a values-based frame. So in addition to leading with shared values, we also want to be telling systemic stories. And I really liked the video that was shared earlier from the Youth Leadership Council, because it was about a bunch of different students and their experiences. And sometimes we fall into the trap of wanting to tell individual stories and holding up individual experiences. But the problem with doing that is that people make judgments about individuals. What choices did they make? Good or bad judgments sometimes. What choices did that individual make that they deserved whatever happened to them? Deserved or didn't deserve? We make that judgment. If we tell stories from a more systemic level, we lead to systemic change. If we tell stories from an individual level, we may get individual help or individual charity, but we don't get systemic change. So I'm originally from the Detroit area, and we had a story that happened in Detroit. It was all over my Facebook. It also made national news, so some of you might be familiar with it, about a man named James Robinson who was walking 21 miles to get to work. And it was a big story, as it should be. But the story was framed about this one man, his incredible work ethic, this bootstrapping American mentality. Nothing was going to stop this man from getting to work. And isn't he amazing, and isn't this an incredible story? And that man is amazing, and it is an incredible story. But unfortunately, because it wasn't framed from a context of why does someone have to walk 21 miles to get to work, why doesn't he have access to transportation, why doesn't he have access to a good job in his community, why does the job he has not pay enough that he can afford a car, none of those questions got asked. And so what happened? People got together, they started a Kickstarter campaign, and they bought James Robinson a car. And everybody patted themselves on the back, and they did a good deed, and they washed their hands of it. And that helped James Robinson, but that didn't further any of the changes that would prevent someone from being in that situation in the first place. And so we want to be really careful about these stories of one, because they lead to changes for one, rather than for everyone, rather than on a systems level that actually make long and transformative change. So I'm going to give you another example of this. Again, it's another public service announcement.
Very impressive, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Thought he was pretty good.
I think we've got enough color around here. 2 points. And who's next?
You drop this.
Imagine the power of one voice. Find yours at freedomcenter.org.
Did anyone find that ad compelling? A few people. It is compelling. Individual stories are compelling. We like to see individual people doing good things and doing the right thing. But the problem is, what story are we telling? Who's the hero in that story? Yeah, it's one individual white guy. If individual white guys could just do better, racism wouldn't exist. We know that that's not actually the way that racism functions. It's a system. And it is made up of individuals who make decisions, yes, but it's much bigger than that. Racism is also not about rogue individual racists. It's about systems and the way that systems work. Okay, we want to talk about obstacles and not just outcomes. So, again, in the criminal justice reform space, a lot of people talk about this disparity between white people and black people and prison rates of incarceration. And for a long time, we talked about just that disparity. And we gave it to people who were other reform-minded advocates, and they filled in a lot of context, and they understood the reason that there's this disparity is because of the way that communities are policed and because of the way that courtrooms work. There's a lot of things to unpack here. But they filled in that context. So this is a statistic. Black males' chance of going to prison is 32% compared to just 6% for white males. But we took that out to persuadable audiences, and we repeated that same message, and what did they hear? Our persuadable audiences heard black men are committing 5 times more crime than white men. So we reinforced a stereotype rather than talking about the actual root of that issue, the root causes, and the obstacles, which are racial disparity, implicit bias, discrimination in policing, discrimination in the courtroom, discrimination in the system writ large, right? So what we could have done instead,
and that may have been a factor here, but the crucial thing is when we look at people from other groups, we just tend to stereotype. I'd invite viewers to go on a website called Project Implicit, and that gives you it's a little online test, it'll take like 5 minutes, of how you process people from your own group and people from other groups. And what you'll find, if you're like the vast majority of human beings, is you process people from other groups differently, and you associate them with violence and other things. And that means it's
say that that's just people of color will find this also.
Exactly.
You take the test and you find that even people of color are more likely to ascribe negative attributes to darker skinned people.
Right. So I just finish one point. That I would say it means that racism is in a disease that's a natural sin that we're born into. And therefore we have to fight it through civilization and through artifice. And by the way, it's one of the reasons when you have somebody with a gun in a neighborhood, it has to be someone trained, and not somebody just floating around.
Let me get Governor.
All right. So the idea there is that we can talk about these issues from an obstacles standpoint. What is standing in the way that is leading to these disparate outcomes? So things like implicit bias, things like discrimination and the way that communities are policed differently, right? Communities of color are policed very differently than white communities. So just giving people those outcomes tends to reinforce their preconceived notions and their stereotypes. So the next general tip, messaging strategy, is that we want to emphasize solutions. And what's been so great for me to see this morning is that y'all have solutions. You have alternatives to lift up, and you should be amplifying those because not everyone knows that those exist. And that can help persuade people. Van Jones likes to say that Martin Luther King Jr. is not famous for saying, "I have a complaint," right? He gave people something aspirational to believe in. And if you just give people another problem, they feel overwhelmed and they feel something called compassion fatigue. I have a lot of problems in my, people have their own problems, right? I've got to get dinner on the table. I've got to pick up my kids from daycare. I've got to, deal with an ailing relative, whatever it is. I've got loud, noisy, disrespectful neighbors, whatever. We have all of our own daily baggage. And then we have the issues that we care about, and we do care about them. But there's a limitation to how much we're willing to do if we don't feel that the problems are solvable, right? Look at what's going on with climate change and the way we talk about climate change. It's so bleak. People feel overwhelmed by it, and they don't know what to do. We need to give people clear solutions. We need to lift up successes and alternatives to say, yes, these problems are big. They're not insurmountable. We actually know how to solve them. We just need to be given the space and the tools to do that. We want to evoke familiar themes and metaphors. So I talked a little bit about familiar themes earlier, this idea of these archetypal stories and how they're very familiar to us, and we like familiarity. Our brains like familiarity. Our brains also are naturally wired to think in metaphor, to think in story. So I just want to illustrate the power of metaphor. What is this a picture of? Just broadly. War, battle. What is this a picture of? Where are my biology brains? It's a virus. Yes, it's a virus. Can you think of something that sometimes gets framed as a war, something we are battling in our communities, versus something that we have to treat in our communities and we have to heal communities from? Can you think of an issue? Drugs. Close. Poverty. In this example, it's crime. Drugs obviously falls into that. They did a study in 2011. Some researchers got together and said, we want to kind of test the power of metaphor. We're going to give people 10 facts about crime. But we're going to lead into those facts with an introductory paragraph using metaphor. So they split people into two groups. One group got same 10 facts about crime, but the metaphor was, we need to fight crime. We need to, this is something that is raging in our communities, and we need to fight it, and we need to battle against it. And the other group got a metaphor that was about, this is something that's plaguing our communities, and we need to treat and heal from it. And people in the crime metaphor group, overwhelmingly, when asked what solutions to crime they would support, wanted punitive solutions. We want more cops on the street, we want more police cars in our neighborhood, we want more people going to jail or prison. And people who were given the virus metaphor were more likely to support rehabilitative solutions. So we want to see alternatives to incarceration, we want to see diversion programs, we want to see reentry programs for people after they're incarcerated to connect back into their communities. And when asked why people supported the solutions they supported, people overwhelmingly said, because of the facts. But they got the same facts. So we know that actually what persuaded them was that metaphor. We often use metaphors that are not necessarily helpful. In the economic opportunity space, and I can imagine in the education space, there's often this metaphor around leveling the playing field. And what that metaphor does is prime people's brains for the idea of competition. And that is not necessarily a helpful framing for the solutions that we're supporting, because the competition frame ensures that there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers, and that that's a natural state of things. Does that make sense? We want to be telling affirmative stories. We often fall into this trap of doing something that we call myth busting. So there's a myth that's out there, and we want to counter that myth, so we just go out and we negate it, right? The CDC learned this. They had a rumor going around on the internet about the flu vaccine. And they were having to fight this rumor that the flu vaccine causes the flu. And so the CDC did a big flyer campaign that was a myth versus fact flyer, which I'm sure you all have seen in many contexts. Myth, the flu vaccine causes the flu. Fact, the flu vaccine does not cause the flu. Here are all the reasons why, da-da-da-da-da-da. And they gave it to focus groups to kind of test it. And people said, yeah, we get it. The flu vaccine does not cause the flu. And they went back to those same people 3 months later, and now something like 30% of them believe that the flu vaccine caused the flu. Because they created a connection in people's minds, even though they were negating it, that stuck. And people didn't really remember the context, they just remembered that connection. So we've seen this a lot in the immigrant rights space. Do not blame immigrants for terrorism. I wasn't even thinking about terrorism when I was thinking about immigration, but now I am. Here's a story from The Bachelor. I don't watch The Bachelor, but I'm inclined to think this guy is probably a jerk, right? A defensive position, a defensive message is never as strong as an affirmative message. We don't have to restate the myth. We can just state the fact. And it is almost always stronger to just leave the myth out entirely. And we can just start from the fact-based area, from the affirmative story that we want to tell. Okay, so that's kind of the messaging strategy and some tips. I want to give you a tool now that y'all can actually workshop, and you're going to work on this a little bit more this afternoon, which we call VPSA. And VPSA is a way of structuring a message that gets at all of the things that I just told you about. So it stands for value, problem, solution, action. So it ensures that we're leading with values. It ensures that we're pivoting quickly to solutions instead of just dwelling on the problem. And it also ensures that we're assigning audiences a specific action that they can do to be a part of that solution. So it ensures that we're thinking about our audience. So this is a tool. Again, we've tested messages using this format, and they do tend to be more persuasive to people than messages that don't use this format. This can be a number of different things, right? It can be a way of just organizing your thoughts. It is a great format for something like an op-ed, if that's something that y'all ever do. A speech. It can even be a social media update. It's a little hard to get everything in on Twitter, but it can be done. So this can really be any way that you are structuring a message to reach a particular audience. You can use the VPSA format for it. So just to break it down, V obviously stands for values. And values are important because they allow our audiences to hear our messages. We sometimes use this metaphor of a flower. You don't hand people a flower roots first. You hand them a flower petals first. You give them the aspirational part first. It's an invitation to a conversation about an issue. Sometimes values need defining. And sometimes actually the value word is not as strong as that definition might be. So think about something like the value of community, which is a value that we all use a lot. When I talk about community, and when the Opportunity Agenda talks about community, we talk about the idea that we share responsibility for each other. That is very different than an idea of community that is, I care about the people on my block, in my town, at my church, or whatever it is, because that can contribute to a very us versus them, a very exclusionary definition of community. So sometimes that word community needs to actually be unpacked a little bit. What do we actually mean by that? I'm sure in your conversations over the last day and a half, you've been talking about the idea of equity. Equity is an important value. But that's one where we're better off using the definition than just the word, because people don't know what it means. They think of equity they have in their home. So what do we mean when we say equity? Let's use the definition instead of the word. Security is another example. When we talk about security, we mean people should have the basic tools to meet their needs. But when some people hear security, they think of homeland security, terrorism, safety, right? So sometimes these values need some unpacking and need some defining. And we're actually more successful when we're very clear about what we mean about the values that we're talking about and we're reclaiming their meaning than when we just use the words themselves. So P stands for problem. That's the next part of this formula. And we want to frame problems as being a direct threat to the values that we're proposing. Facts and statistics fit here in our problem section. We want to be careful and use those sparingly. Again, if we overwhelm people with facts and statistics, they just get overwhelmed. They get lost in a sea of data. But we can think about concepts like social math. Does anyone know what social math is? One person. Social math is the idea of taking really large numbers and putting them in more of a narrative context. So creating a story out of that large number. I consider myself a fairly intelligent person. I don't really, this is a little embarrassing, I don't really know the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. I think 1 billion is 100 millions. Maybe it's 1,000 millions. I'm really not sure. Those are enormous numbers that are very difficult for people to grasp. And when we just give them these enormous numbers, again, it's overwhelming and it gets in the way of their empathy. It gets in the way of their ability to care about an issue because it contributes to that feeling of insurmountability. So we can use social math to break down large numbers into something people can imagine and their minds can actually grasp. So this is just an example. The cost to incarcerate one person from Baltimore is $37,000 a year, which is a number that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. But when you frame it this way, that's enough money to buy 1 month of housing for 30 families. Now I can imagine that. This also sets us up to think about competing priorities, which is another nice additive benefit. And the other thing about the problems and the way we need to set them up is that these problems are not just the problems of the people they affect, but that these problems reflect on all of us because they violate our values. So this is about all of us. We share responsibility for each other, and so when these values are being violated, we're all implicated, and we all have to be part of the solution. So again, solutions, we talked about this earlier, providing those examples of success and alternatives, really lifting that up so people know not only can these problems be solved, but I'm the person you should listen to about how to solve them. Don't just listen to everyone else telling you about how this problem cannot be fixed. And then lastly, we want to give people a concrete action that they can picture themselves doing. So again, our mind thinks in pictures, our mind thinks in story. So rather than saying to someone, learn more about this, I can't really picture myself learning more, tell them, sign a petition on our website, follow us on Facebook, pick up the phone and call your legislator. Something very concrete that I can imagine myself doing. And when you get people involved and you get people to take action, even if it's something small, you actually create a buy-in in their brains that makes it much harder for them in the future to not continue to take action for you. Once they've done even a small step, they're more likely to take action for you in the future because they feel they have some buy-in. All right, so that's VPSA. I want to give you a couple examples of what this actually looks like because it can feel kind of vague. This is Daryl Atkinson. He's an advocate, again, in the criminal justice reform space that we've worked with a lot. He's gone through several of our trainings, so he's gotten very good at this. But he's talking about a program called Ban the Box, which is a reentry program for people who have been in prison. Just listen to how he uses the VPSA format. He's on Melissa Harris Perry, so she also gives him a lot of time because she's sympathetic. But just listen, see if you can catch each of the elements.
President Obama's action, however, those with criminal records seeking federal agency jobs will no longer have to report their felonies on those applications. Federal employers will still be able to ask about the criminal histories of qualified applicants who have been sent to hiring managers, but the removal of the box on the initial application allows applicants with records to get a foot in the door before stigma blocks the entrance. The executive action will not apply to federal contractors or private employers, but it's a step for a national effort to ban the box. Joining the panel now from Raleigh, North Carolina is Daryl Atkinson, Senior Staff Attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Nice to see you this morning.
Thank you for having me on the show, Melissa.
Can you talk to me about why the box is meaningful, what difference it makes?
Sure. The president's action on Monday really affirms values that we hold dear in this country, values like inclusion and equal opportunity for all people, because people with records face legal discrimination in many areas of life. The 65 million Americans, 1 in 3 adult Americans that have criminal record history, face barriers in employment, housing, education, even volunteering in their children's school they may not be able to do. The American Bar Association has cataloged over 44,000 legal barriers that shut people out of just the basic necessities of life. And because African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, it results in a social and economic exclusion similar to the Jim Crow South. So what the president did on Monday, a common sense solution like Ban the Box that was birthed out of the formerly incarcerated community, a group called All of Us Are None. Some formerly incarcerated people in Oakland, California developed that term and the policy that's attended to it. It really opens up opportunity for people with records. But I must say, we need this administration and the president to continue to exert their executive authority and apply a similar policy to independent contractors who represent 25% of the American workforce, so people with records can continue to have access to opportunity.
All right, so stick.
Okay. Did you catch the values? He talks about the value of inclusion. I think he talks about the value of opportunity. He talks about the problem being that we're not including people, we're actually creating social and economic exclusion. So the problem is a direct threat to those values. The solution is a program like Ban the Box. And the action, he specifically calls on the president to take Ban the Box one step further and apply it to federal contractors. So it's a very full VPSA. This is an example talking about health care. This is at I think a city council meeting. I'm not sure where. It might be in Arkansas. This is not someone we trained, but she just sort of intuitively uses a very values-based approach to make her point.
My question is lengthy, okay, so bear with me. My name is Jessie Bohan, and I'm in your district. It's from my understanding the ACA mandate requires everybody to have insurance because the healthy people pull up the sick people, right? And as a Christian, my whole philosophy in life is pull up the unfortunate. Yes. Okay? So the individual mandate, that's what it does. The healthy people pull up the sick. Yes. If we take those people and we put them in high-risk insurance pools, they're costlier and there's less coverage for them. That's the way it's been in the past, and that's the way it will be again. So we are effectively punishing our sickest people. And I want to know why not, instead of fix what's wrong with Obamacare, make companies like Aetna that pulled out and lied to their consumers about why they pulled out and said they pulled out because Obamacare was too expensive, but they really pulled out because of a merger. why don't we expand Medicaid and have everybody have insurance? Because we are going to effectively.
Okay. So those are just some examples to get you to see what this actually looks like. And I want to go back to the conversation that we had earlier about narrative. If we use this VPSA structure in the way that we talk about our issues and we go back to our work and back to our communities, we ensure that by rooting our messaging in values, we are contributing to the creation of that long-term movement, to that long-term narrative that we're trying to build about what does the future of education look like, the future of learning, what does that look like? And what are the values that are important to ensuring that that happens? And so we're going to move into actually, y'all are going to get to talk about how to apply some of these lessons to the education context in some small group discussions. But I've just thrown a lot of information at you, and I want to take a little bit of time for any questions.
When you talk about action at the end, is the idea that it's supposed to be a concrete action specifically for your audience? So in the first example here, I think the action was the president should blah, 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 right? But in that moment, the speaker wasn't really addressing the president.
Right.
So what have you found about what kinds of action statements are most effective?
Yeah, that's a great point. So Daryl does call on the president, and his action statement is targeted to a specific decision maker rather than to the audience that he's speaking to on that news program. Your action should be tailored to that specific audience. I think what he's kind of doing is playing with the idea of primary and secondary audiences. So if my audience puts pressure on the president, maybe this is an action that he will take. So sometimes we're calling out specific decision makers. Also in the example of being at a city council meeting, you're speaking directly to the decision makers. You're asking them to take action, but there's also people in the room, and in this case, video cameras. So you're reaching another audience as well. So it just kind of depends on the context, but generally, yes, your action should be about what a specific audience can do to be a part of your solution.
Is this on? I actually had the same question, and I was wondering a little bit, I think as I think about pivoting to our context here, to what extent is audience linked to a perspective about obstacle? Like what's actually standing in the way of the big change? And how clear do folks need to be about that as they're sort of starting in this process? Or how clear a hypothesis do they need to have?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things to unpack there. One is who's actually responsible for making the decision? So that's part of it, which is that's not always your audience. Sometimes that's your audience. But be really clear about assigning responsibility, that these are actually, again, not just natural states of being and things that happen, but rather the results of decisions and priorities that people have made. And so being really clear about who has the responsibility then to change those priorities and change those decisions. And what was, tell me your question again?
That was responsive to me.
Okay.
But, yeah.
My friend here got me thinking about this an hour ago, but you didn't talk at all about, and particularly in education, we talk about this a lot when we think about our community audience being parents. You didn't talk about how different cultures receive messages, and how do you think about that? Because to me that feels very important as we in education, different cultures and families hear things differently.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the more specific and targeted we can get about our audiences, the better. So if we just talk about parents as a monolithic audience, we may not actually be having the most persuasive dialogue, because there are some parents that are going to fall potentially closer to that 3 or 4 range. And there are some parents with some of the solutions we're proposing that maybe are a 1 or a 2. And so we want to get really as specific as we possibly can. And sometimes that's hard, and sometimes it also feels kind of uncomfortable because we're making a lot of assumptions about people. But it helps us tell better stories and make sure that we're being responsive to the actual values that are going to move them. So if you're in a school district where it's possible for you to look at parents and try to figure out, okay, which parents are going to be more likely to be difficult to persuade, and which parents might be more of the low-hanging fruit, and can I get those low-hanging fruit to support me first, and then how do I actually build this to bring everyone else along? So I think actually the more specific and more segmented you can get it, the more effective you're going to be, rather than just lumping all parents together and thinking that your message is going to work for all of them.
Oh, hi. Oh, that is very loud. So I work a lot with policymakers directly, and one of the things we've discovered is that like people have a complete misunderstanding of who is a policymaker and what is a policy. And in our context, I have been trying to reframe or rebrand policy as an expression of values. They are. Like No Child Left Behind was an expression of values about what we care about in schools and for kids and things like that.
Right.
And so and that actually has a lot more resonance with people. So I'm wondering in your work if what successes you've had or what advice you have about reframing discussions around policy and policymakers, and who has the locus of power and control to make that more accessible and for people to be able to better understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're articulating exactly what it is that we're proposing, which is that all of these decisions and all of the messaging that we do, whether we're trying to move policy or we're trying to enact specific programs in specific schools, we have to root those conversations in values. We have to shift those conversations to being about what kinds of decisions do we want to make as a body of people, whether that's a governing body like a legislature or whether that's a district body or a school body or school leadership. How are we going to fundamentally make different decisions that are rooted in values and not just rooted in the bottom line or rooted in like what we think we can actually do or accomplish? How do we get people to be more visionary and to open them up to that conversation? And how you do that is through shared values, which is exactly something that you're doing. So I think that that's, how is it working for you? It seems to be working.
Somewhat.
Okay.
Like, to your point, like sometimes people don't know who has decision-making authority or what a policy is. They see like ESSA or a big like federal piece of legislation or law as policy, but not like what a school board enacts as a form of policy, or like a decision that a principal makes as a policy that is either enforceable or is like an expression of values about what we care about. And I think that those are sometimes intractable. And being able to understand that a policy isn't just something that's on a piece of paper, but it's actually like values that we hold as communities, and you can actually change those.
Right. Yeah, we've had some movement in the economic opportunity work that we do with groups starting to talk about budgets that way, because budgets are really hard to get people to care about, even though they're obviously extremely important because they're boring. Again, people don't want to hear about a bunch of facts and figures. But if you talk about budgets as a moral document, as a priority setting document that speaks to our values, they've started to see a little bit of movement with some of that framing.
I'm wondering how we navigate a situation where you might have competing values. So as an example, there's some parents out there who will nod vigorously when you talk about 21st century skills and all the kinds of powerful learning that leads to all that. And at the same time, they'll say, that's not the game that the colleges are playing in their admissions requirements. And so we get all that, but we still want to have you work with our kid to produce the transcript that's going to get them into the best college. So they are caring about both of those somewhat right now competitive things at once.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So help me solve that one.
Sure. So two things to unpack there. One is that human beings are extremely contradictory in the way that they think. We all hold competing ideas in our heads. We all have priorities and thoughts that do not compute with each other. And so our job as communicators is to evoke the right set of those values, the right set of those themes, to make sure that we're provoking the side of people's brains that's going to get them towards a more solutions-oriented approach. To your specific point about the values that are competing for you, the competing value there is a pragmatism value. We want to do what's going to work, right? We want to do what's going to get our kids into college. So how do we reframe what we're proposing in a pragmatic way? How do we give them that common sense that they're searching for, that pragmatism that they're searching for, on our side? So it might be a subtle reframe that actually is about making your argument the pragmatic one, making your argument the one that makes sense, and that it's a common sense solution. People love the concept of common sense. We do a lot of message testing where anytime you even use the word common sense, people are like, yes, 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 yes. They love it. So, you know, to me, that's actually something you can possibly reframe for your own side.
Bridget, I had another that came up as I was going around the room. thinking of that picture you showed of the mural and then I think the playground or the slide on 7th Street that needed to be fixed. And I'm wondering about the solution piece of VPSA, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about solutions, we're talking about the slide or the merry-go-round. We're talking about different programmatic elements that need to show up, but maybe not together painting as compelling a picture of how all those come together. And I'm curious if there's anything more you could say about that.
Sure. So the way that I would sort of parse that out is your solution, again, is messaging level. So it's short term. I'm going to talk to this audience today about this one specific thing, this one specific policy, and I'm going to propose a solution for them, versus your vision, which is really an element of your narrative. So what is the story I'm trying to tell, and what is the picture I'm trying to paint about how this looks? Again, people think visually. We had in the discussion in our group earlier some conversations around how to put students' voices first. And one of the things that came up was, that's hard for me to envision because I've never seen it. So the articulation of that big picture vision is really powerful because sometimes it takes that, what does this actually look like, for people to be able to imagine it. They might like the idea of it, but if it doesn't seem feasible, if it's not something their brains can actually see, then we haven't done a good enough job of articulating that vision. Okay, one more question, and then we're going to move into some small group discussion.
And in both examples, I think they sort of talked about the macro, right? X% of people aren't able to access these opportunities, et cetera. Is it really the macro that's more effective, or is it a mix of the two to get to sort of the big picture and the tangible?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. There is this tension between telling stories that are human and that people can actually connect to other humans in the story, which is what leads them to feel empathy, and telling a story that holds up one human for judgment. So ways to get around this are things like group stories. So the more you have the power of several people who have different experiences and are bringing different perspectives to it, but are echoing the same systemic problem, is good. We can also use messengers called, like, I have a healthcare example that I sometimes show. Has anyone ever seen the documentary Sicko? The, what's his name? Michael Moore documentary. He does a really effective job of this, of talking about the problems with healthcare. And he uses a woman who works in an insurance call center and how she sees the system from her unique perspective because she's a part of that system. So she's an individual, but she's telling the story about the way the system is failing and her own actual role in that. So she talks about how she gets people on the phone and she knows they're going to be denied for insurance and the emotional toll that that takes on her. So she's an individual storyteller, but she's telling a systemic story. Does that make sense? Does that make it a little clearer? If you get stuck, the power of group stories. Just stick to group stories. Yeah?
I just wanted to add to that, the analog, I think, in education would be, instead of focusing on the individual student and the triumph of the individual student, focusing on the teacher and what's the teacher's vantage point in the class.
Right, because the teacher is a mechanism of that system, of the educational system. Okay, so I want to move us into some small group discussion. So I think you'll just stay at your tables for this and talk to the people that are nearest you. The first discussion is around audiences. Who is persuadable from your perspective in the work that you do in your unique, wherever you sort of sit in this issue? Who is persuadable? And be as specific about that question as you can. Again, maybe it might be more specific than just parents, right? Which parents? Parents that have what kind of attitudes? Parents who might have supported what kind of other issues?
And the frame that people should have in doing this is not necessarily advocate for your own program. It's you as a social change agent on behalf of the mural, the big vision.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going to we've got about 20 minutes for small group, and then we're going to do the example, Bridget. So how do you want to break up that?
Let's do about 7 minutes on this. Okay. Yep. Let's come back together. That was quick. I actually gave you less time than I was going to give you. Because I want to make sure this audience piece is critically important. And you're going to have some more time to talk about it in the breakout session this afternoon. But I want to make sure that we give plenty of time to actually talk about the values piece of this. because I think that's more foundational. And so you can get into more discussions about audience this afternoon once you kind of have that grounding in this vision and values piece. So we're going to move now to discussion in your small groups around values. And you have in your workbook, towards the back, there's a worksheet around the breakout session this afternoon. So these discussions are just to kind of prime you for the work you're going to do this afternoon. In that workbook, you have 4 values that are defined for you. And these are values that Frameworks Institute, which is another organization like the Opportunity Agenda, has actually tested in an education context and found that these were values that really resonated for people when talking about changing the way we think about education and the way we think about learning. So you have those 4 values in your workbook. They're defined for you. So we're just going to discuss, again, you're going to have more time to work on this in the afternoon, but for now, just big picture level, what about those values resonates for you? If you can think about some of those values that might resonate with specific audiences, but that might also be a question for the afternoon, just how do those values strike you? And Jane, do you want to say anything more about the values?
So I used to be at Frameworks Institute, some of you know that already. And these values were tested in multiple ways, qualitative and quantitative methods. And they're kind of, I think pragmatism maybe is one that's a little bit of an outlier, but the other 3 you'll see are kind of part of a family of values. They all are really oriented toward the future and toward an aspiration and a collective aspiration. So I would say that that's the main thing to keep in mind is we're going for a collective aspiration.
Great. So just take about 12 minutes to just discuss the values, how they sit with you, if they're resonating. Did anyone have something that came up in their group that they want to share? Either an aha moment or a challenge that still feels like you're not quite there? Anyone want to share either an aha moment or a challenge that still feels like you have to work for a little harder? Yep. Do you need a mic? Perfect.
Okay, I will lower my voice to meet the mic. So we were having Michelle Ademega from the Achievement Network, also known as ANET. We were having a conversation specifically around the framing of values. And one reflection I'm having from that conversation is the power of putting your value in a way that somebody can't disagree with it, right? So we were talking about the need to provide resources for students who are English language learners. And framing the first premise of the value around, it's really critical for us in education to tap into the potential of every student, right? First, if you say no, that we don't want to tap into the potential of every student, we need to have a separate conversation and you might not be a good person. But like starting with that value first and then framing it around, and in our classrooms, there are students who we are clouded by what we believe are deficits, that we're not able to access their full potential. And how do we create systems and supports that actually tap into that? So it was just helpful for me to think about framing values in a way that most people would nod along with because they agree, and the power of how that can take you through a conversation, and for yourself on how you think about your solution and how it's connected back to that shared value. So I think that was a helpful exercise for me.
Great. Any other reflections?
The PAIR Institute, Partnerships in Education and Resiliency. So our table, I'm just representing our table, didn't like these frameworks, wherever they come from. It's not a statement about frameworks, but we thought they were far too general, and we used the term vanilla. I don't know whether that helps, but we didn't really feel, we wouldn't be moved by them. So we had 3 areas that we did feel could move us. One is the frame of democracy, that if you don't invest in schools and the diversity that comes together and is shaped into something of a united world, well, then you have the society we have right now. So we actually feel like there's a big role for schools to actually have that role. The second one was a frame of families and communities, that they have a dream for their children, and that could actually capture people's imagination. That dream has to be different, as we learned this morning. That dream has to be different than what is being presented right now in most schools. So, and the third one is kind of the economy, that everyone, and they all are linked in some ways, that if we want young people to be participating in the present and the future economy and have equal opportunities, creativity, personal identity, all of those things that in the past were maybe not as important are now super important. So those are the three ways we would go from what we consider too general to something that's maybe more inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane, did you want to?
Okay. So just to respond to that, not to defend or anything, so these particular frames were created to bring all kinds of people under the tent, and as I listen to you, I agree with you, but you and I have a similar political orientation, and I would say that probably 99.999% of this room has a similar political orientation. That's great for mobilizing your base. If you want to bring, and with the exception perhaps of the economy, that one, and so I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that you need to get people who are not under your tent, your natural tent. The other thing about the general nature of them is, first of all, values are meant to be general so that many, many people can come. That's the rest of your messaging that's going to give the meat. And the other thing I want to say is the words on the page, and maybe I should have said this before, you never have to use those specific words. They're really about conceptual frames, not about the words themselves.
Thanks. I think we have time for one. Also on the economic piece, since y'all brought it up, I think that can work with certain audiences, but I think we want to be careful about always framing things from an economic perspective, because that's not actually why it's important to teach children and for children to learn, is not just so that they can become part of an economy, but also just because it's the right thing to do, and they are human beings with inherent dignity and the ability to learn, and we should be cultivating and nurturing that. Sometimes we have to make economic arguments to certain audiences, but I don't know that it should be a prevailing values argument, but that's sort of my particular opinion. Okay.
I was getting popcorn, so I don't know what we're talking about, so I'm just going to share thoughts.
Okay.
Are we just responding?
Great.
Okay, so, sorry. In the back, I'm sorry. Okay, so we had a pretty wide-ranging discussion, so I'll just kind of narrate what happened, and Tabor will help me out with this. So from my own personal perspective, like, progress deeply resonated with me as a value, but also as a word and also as a strength, because I think that it can evoke some very intense scenarios that you can set up to make this messaging much easier to comprehend. So if I'm thinking about progress, I can very easily frame a problem in terms of what happened and where we want to go. If I'm thinking about a solution, I can very easily frame a solution in terms of where have we been and what does it mean to progress. If I'm thinking about action in progress, I can, even the word feels very action-oriented. So that was the first idea. The second thing we talked about was how dangerous we found pragmatism, actually. That pragmatism absent of a power analysis can be very much so married to maintain a status quo. It is pragmatic to have free labor. Okay, it's just, yeah, that one felt a little dangerous, but you see what I mean. If people are in different power now, it can be, that's not pragmatic, let me go on. One of my favorite quotes is from Michelle Alexander. She was writing, new Jim Crow author. She was writing a piece in The Nation, and she said, when I walk into a room and politicians tell me immediately what is pragmatic or not, that's a room that I leave. I have to go away. So there's something about pragmatism that, absent of a proper power analysis, can maintain. So we felt a little uncomfortable about that one. And then the human potential common good, an idea that we shared, this emotionally resonated with all of us. But one idea that we had is that some of these values have a who, what, why, how aspect to them, and that actually the human potential common good felt like a why value that could undergird a messaging of progress or could undergird others. But we wondered if what the limitations of that being the salient value could be, depending on different groups. So that was kind of the conversation. Was that right? Okay.
Great.
That was what we talked about.
Awesome. I want to move us along because y'all are going to have more time in the afternoon to talk about this and actually develop and tweak some messaging. I have one more person with a microphone, but then we're going to move in. We have a couple other reflections on messaging, and then we'll go to lunch, and then y'all will have more time to work.
I'll just make it really quick. Okay. I think just to piggyback on all of the conversations that were stated before, is that we talked about this footing in both places, and a lot of times in audiences I start a conversation with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald that says, you know, I have to think about operating with two opposing views in my mind and still be sane at the same time. And one of the things we talked about at this table was how do we, in a room, when that is happening, think about something that pulls everybody in the room. And normally we say, take out your phone, get a picture of your child or some youth in your life, and then tell me which one of them deserves the best education in the world. And if you can't pick, then we have to talk about a whole lot of things, and also why we need to do it for everyone based on what's our economic future, based on our political future, based on our safety, based on all these needs that children have, that communities have, and that we have as a nation.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone.